Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Now on to our next panel.
Hi, we're really excited to be here to talk about remote work. I'm John Horton.
I'm Geoff Parker.
I'm Jerry Carter.
And we thought we'd started off with some of our prep that happened right before here. I have my daughter with me today because they're on February vacation. The three of us were chatting, what are we going to talk about? And we said, Ada, what did you think of remote work? And she said, not remote work, remote school rather, sorry.
Yeah. She had a very succinct answer. It was kind of annoying.
I think a lot of people that had never worked remotely when the pandemic hit had a lot of the same sort of sentiment from it. But I think for those of us, I've worked remotely for a couple of decades. And when everybody went remote and everything sort of evened the playing field, a lot of the things that were annoying before all of a sudden got a lot better. Right? I mean, if you were in the conference room before and everybody's having the conversation and you're trying to hear through whatever bad polycom system is in the room, and it was horrible. But our nieces went through some of the remote learning, and the experiences have been extremely varied. So, but I think it was kind of annoying. Certainly started off, and hopefully is getting better in a lot of cases. So,
I had an interesting and kind of similar experience. I had two college students who were away, and then all of a sudden they bounced back. And it turned out that some things translated pretty well. So for example, I was teaching data science, I was using R and Python and SQL, and you had exercises and you could do breakout groups. That translated. It turns out that a 3-hour English seminar, if you don't redesign that experience with the end user and the student in mind, that's pretty clunky.
So here's an interesting question, and maybe I'll sort of see what you both think. I have my opinions, but what changed and what didn't? Because I think with everybody going remote and sort of different types of jobs work differently, but when everybody went remote, what really changed? Because everybody thinks everything changed. I have a theory that some things did and some things didn't. So what changed? What didn't change? What's sort of the same? What's kind of, maybe what have we learned? I'd be curious to know what your thoughts on it. I don't know, John, if you want to start.
Yeah,
or
maybe, and yeah, John, maybe first just say a little bit about sort of how you came to think about these things.
So, partially I'm a labor economist by training, and I've been particularly interested in online labor markets for many years. So things like Mechanical Turk and Upwork. And, one of the things that's really kind of fascinating about these markets, historically labor markets have almost been defined by the fact that they're like geographically located. You have to be sort of, everyone's co-located, and then the world changes and now we have these kind of online markets. And then come the pandemic, we sort of all kind of jumped into this like online marketplace, online labor market configuration. And so it was kind of very natural for me to be kind of interested in this as a topic. I think, to your question of like what changed, what stayed the same, I think some things I observed was a push towards more asynchronous ways of production, that you can't kind of expect that you're going to be able to grab someone. And so you kind of have to plan, how do we do things in a way so that no one's going to be a bottleneck, and that, maybe a slightly more documentation focused culture, like if you want to know how something works, you have to read about it. So I think that's partially it. In my online teaching, to kind of echo what you were saying, Geoff, there were certain things, like I was teaching programming as well, and in some ways, I had all the students say like on a Replit, which is a great company, and I could kind of drop in and sort of see what they were doing very, very easily. And in a classroom, I'm kind of bouncing around the room, and in some ways, actually, the online node geography actually made it a little bit better. But as far as like other things that stayed the same, I mean, the fundamental problems are still there of like how do you coordinate production and how do you kind of get people synced up on things.
Yeah, I was interested in similar problems really from the very beginning of my career, which was around how do you coordinate complex knowledge work, and especially in the kind of wave of outsourcing. So we had that big transition from the 80s into the 90s where we essentially disintegrated firms, and then we had tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 sort of firms that you outsourced work to. And of course, it's much easier to outsource a screw than, say, power management software or security software. And so the coordination mechanisms and the information flows that were required to make that work well, and frankly, the design of the subsystems and sort of minimizing the information flows across boundaries, these were all things that came into the fore in a really dramatic and fast way, when COVID happened.
I think so. The asynchronous communication problem is really interesting. So I guess 3 years ago, I would have considered myself to be the practitioner of the group. I've kind of always been remote from a very small town in the southeastern U.S. And so it's a bit of an oddity, but I've worked for companies in the West Coast. I've been a part of open source and kind of global communities as a individual contributor and as a leader. The asynchronous communication problem is really interesting, and I'll say it, maybe I'll kind of respond like this. I think one of the things that didn't change was the competencies of leadership. I think that it did take a lot of people that were leading individual teams and smaller teams that relied upon skills that were very easy when you were located together to start to think more like a global leader and to think about time zones and to think about asynchronous communication, to think about how to coordinate that work, how to trust but verify, how to do outcome-based work instead of output-based work. The thing that I think fundamentally changed was the humanity, though. And the reason why I say that is because we were invited into people's homes. We saw their kids, we saw their dogs. People sort of, showed up in baseball caps and, ski caps. And they just kind of gave more a candid, authentic view of who they were. Now, the reason why I think that's really important is because I know one of the questions that we've talked about is how do you transition a team to remote work now? And I think, John, you had made the comment about some of the research says, well, the strong ties got stronger and the weak ties got weaker. And then we've had this question of, well, what about the people that actually joined the workforce, the labor force during the pandemic and have never been in an office? And I think that humanity, that the technology enabled us to connect sort of shortened the social distance, which made some things that were very easy kind of in the office and we sort of took for granted. We had to be a little bit more intentional about, but I think the technology kind of enabled it. So, maybe that is kind of the question of if we had to do it all again, what would we do better to take a team remote today than just sort of, all of a sudden there's a memo to the global company and like, hey, don't come into the office, you're gonna be working remote. Like what do you think we would do different?
Well, so let me circle back to something that really resonates. You said you were the practitioner having done this, 20
maybe a little bit more
years.
practice now, but
now all of a
everybody
sudden
is.
we all have that
Yeah.
experience, but
We're all Zoom jockeys.
kind of abruptly. But I go back to the intentionality and particularly around the social interaction. And I think some of the successes and failures were much more around, did you enable or create space for or intentionally create almost random small group interactions, especially with people, and my context is students, but didn't necessarily know one another. And then I probably spent much more of my thought in preparing people to randomly meet or randomly assign them to do pretty intense projects, things together, much more than I ever would have prior to that. And then thinking a lot about, we had this isolated person problem. And honestly, higher ed had a lot of fairly bad press that came out of this. And, how do you intentionally have the check-in points and sort of monitor the well-being of remote people?
I think this, attempt to try to like engineer serendipity. I mean, it almost sounds like an oxymoron or a paradox or whatever. But, it's a little bit hard because it's like, okay, great, one more Zoom meeting to add to the kind of the plate of Zoom meetings I already have. I have a good friend who started and ran a remote company. It was called collage.com from way back. And, what he would do right from the get-go, it was remote. And, they would have, twice a year bring everyone to Ann Arbor, where he was from. And it was very much like just a social event. And I think that's where he tried to kind of pack all that social interaction into a sort of a short window. I think he thought that it worked reasonably well, but I do think that, in the pandemic, obviously that wasn't really possible. The whole point was to sort of stay separate. But trying to create some of those social ties, it seems a little bit still like an unsolved problem.
I agree. I think Zoom and meetings, and we were talking about this sort of, it's not fair to the technology, but certainly from the way that we've adopted the technology, the notion of Zoom versus FaceTime is very different from a social interaction. Zoom has tended to be more transactional. And I think what I've noticed is that we've had more meetings back to back that have actually left us with less time kind of in between for the serendipitous moments. But at the same time, I've seen people chew through the first 5 or 10 minutes of the meeting. People will, in some cases, if they can, join early just to have the social interaction. That's an interesting phenomenon because you'd think that they would be just fatigued from it all. And we talked about that a little bit as well. I think that when it comes to serendipity, there was a quote from a guy named Alan Nelson that always stuck with me. He said, when it comes to relationship, 60 is less than 2 times 30, which is less than 4 times 15, which makes no sense from a math standpoint. But what he meant was more frequent interactions build better and maintain relationships. And I think in a remote environment like that's critical. So it was kind of one of the observations that I had learned.
Yeah, actually, and that kind of triggers a discussion we were having. So we've gone through the pandemic. We were in lockdown. You've got this, I think, kind of interesting and relatively rare experience of 20 plus years of remote back in the Polycom days when you were like the echoing voice in a big conference room. What were the cadences of in-person relative to remote work that you think helped, and how has that potentially changed post-COVID?
So that is actually a fascinating question because I think there's the answer of how often I was expected to be in the office even as remote, and then how often it was really needed and what was the reason why I was coming to the office. So if the culture, if sort of the expectation is real work happens in person, then there was an incredible pressure to sort of be there pretty regularly. And just prior to the pandemic, I think I was traveling back and forth to Seattle from Alabama like every other week. Like it was a lot. But I think that the thing that made that really easy is that I didn't have to coordinate a schedule with anybody else. I could go to the office because I knew everybody was in the office. And so there was a reason to go, and then you could have those serendipitous moments. Since, I guess, March of 2020, the first time that I actually traveled for business was May of 2022, so 2.5 years. I had people that were on my teams that I never met. And now there's really nobody, there's no critical mass of people in the office to go to. You can't just do drive-bys. You have to organize, you have to say, okay, we're going to do more outcome-based meetings because we've also had other people that have dispersed and they've moved from Seattle to Arizona or to Pennsylvania. So you have to logistically kind of get that back into the office. I think to the question of how often is needed, I think that task-oriented or kind of coordination of transactional work is very effective to be done remotely. I think the high bandwidth conversations that are more ambiguous, that have more of a strategy component, that require more of the interaction of do I talk, do I not talk, like the whole body language thing, like the bandwidth that's needed for those requires more. So I think it depends, I think it really depends upon the team. I think it depends upon the type of work. I think it depends upon the type of problem that you're trying to solve. And I think whether or not you're able to shorten that psychological distance socially versus, being in person versus being remote. I mean, that's been my experience. I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all answer for it. So,
the point that you just made about it, when it's something where there has to be lots of back and forth, like even right now, as everyone knows, we're in the studio together, and it's very easy to say, okay, you're done talking, and now I can kind of talk without kind of worrying about stepping on you.
Is it really?
It's not too bad. But it's easy. It's very high bandwidth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, you're not. But in Zoom, I mean, how many of us had this experience of sorry, you're trying to talk and you're futzing around with your camera, and I think it's just enough of a tax on the kind of back and forth and interaction that I do think it makes it more difficult to do the kind of work that you're talking about.
It does, and I also think that in some ways people have adapted kind of social cues to the technology. I see more people that are now, kind of here's the rules of engagement. They use the raise the hand icon. I actually have one person that I used to work with, and I knew that when they went off video, they were mad. So, you're sort of texting them, hey, are you okay? Is everything good? And I think that's actually another interesting question that came up is this interaction is very high bandwidth here, but I think even in remote meetings, we talked a little bit about the back channel conversation. So I'm kind of curious about good, bad, how does that actually work?
I mean, I think it's interesting because you do get a lot of bilateral texting that happens, especially between people who already have a close working relationship. That can either help clarify or, and I think we talked about this, that can be pretty negative because that means there's information being transmitted in a meeting that's not shared. And then the flip side is I think these public chats are pretty great because people are laying in information. They're putting, for example, references and links and say, that was a great point, and and have bounce off. That actually creates an archive that can help add value after the fact. So in that case, there's an augmentation. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's nice, and you potentially do capture a lot more information. I think I think people are sometimes, they kind of pull their punches in public. Like if they this is maybe not such a great idea, but they don't want to kind of be the kind of person who says that in a very public forum. So I think maybe there has to be ways to kind of engineer. You can give dissent without it being quite so public. And I mean, even wonder, maybe in person, you're more likely to have kind of smaller meetings, or exactly who's there. I've had some cases where I said maybe some sharp things in a document that then got shared more broadly than I had anticipated.
Never had that happen. Ever.
And so the fact that you maybe don't know your audience and you really don't even know the kind of how far your words are going to go when they're being recorded, that maybe adds a little bit of complexity to this.
Let's just go straight up with self-censorship.
Yeah, it's a kind of self-censorship.
Yeah.
I have this notion of I've kind of called it social spatial awareness. There's this awkward feeling when you're in a room and you're saying something and then you realize the person is right behind you. But on Zoom, not everybody joins video. And how many times have you been in a meeting and there's a whole raft of people that's on the side and you don't actually know that they're there? So I think, from the social interaction standpoint, there are more opportunities to not be transparent. There's more opportunities for sort of social faux pas. But I actually have seen some of those kind of conversations actually solidify a point, and then somebody gets teed up to be the dissenting voice that they may not have had kind of critical mass to be able to take that position. They weren't sure where everybody else was. So I think like most things in technology, it actually has to do with how the interpersonal interactions happen, whether they're kind of in a back channel, but everything can be used sort of nefariously or not. So we use them a lot for various reasons, to try to kind of figure out or kind of ask questions, because I think because the interaction is so hard too, the social chats give us a way to not interrupt, but there's a question that we have, so they can support the conversation, but they can also detract. So I think that was an interesting one. Maybe another question is around, we talked about the humanity, but what about leadership? I mean, what's different about kind of being a leader in this environment as opposed to being a team member or interacting with people on the team? What stands out?
Well, I think one of the points, and you might have made this, was that when you become, especially a new leader, you can kind of get away with a lot of on-the-job learning because you've got a tremendous amount of feedback right away. But once you're leading a distributed team, again, you've got to be pretty mindful of the dynamics and particularly the communication flows, because there's a lot of opportunity for sort of gaps, delays, and then distortion. So if you take sort of an information view, this is the problem you end up having to design and engineer.
And so how do you design that feedback loop if you're remote? Because I think you're right. I think the immediate feedback is somebody that steps into that role. It's like the bar has been raised. Yeah. But how do you design the feedback loop?
Yeah, I mean, I think so one anecdote. I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, and it was remote, and I was talking, And apparently at some point my internet failed, and I kept going with my slides and talked for like another 10 minutes until I like noticed that I was getting emails like, hey, you're not actually online. And so now I'm probably going to be scarred by that forever, that I'm always going to be curious whether or not is anyone out there? So
Is this mic on?
but I think it reminds me, in a prior life I was in the Army, and like one of the processes when you're giving orders is then you make the soldiers brief it back to you. Like, what did I just tell you? And it was like that kind of handshake that you got confirmation. People are tired, and there's a lot of things that are confusing. But your question is like, how do you know if like the message is getting through, and are people sort of on board? Maybe giving people quizzes on what you just said, it would be a little bit too academic.
You're in academics, yeah. I was going to ask. I don't know that works for me.
Close your books.
But your order thing, going back to prior work, when you have to translate across language, you definitely have to run that back feedback. Okay, you're in a different language. Now say back to me, not in precise words, but your understanding of what I just asked, or of what the task is.
And that's a common technique for leadership anyways. And I think it's the intentionality, to go back to your comment before, it's the intentionality about being a leader, which is really hard when you're going from an individual contributor and stepping into that first leadership role. It's
I have
really
to
hard.
give a really funny example, because there was an oil and gas sensor company, and they were instrumenting in a jungle some down well tooling and instruments. And so one of the specs was that it had to be monkey proof. And so it had a pretty much robust industrial control system, and it had really big buttons. And so, yeah, it was clearly monkey proof until the system was installed and the flesh and blood monkeys went and tore all of it apart. And they said, no, we were pretty sure that we meant monkey proof.
We call that beta testing.
I was, until you kind of really clarified at the end, I wasn't sure if you meant like literally monkey proof. Like it was like maybe like a term of art for, So in the spirit of talking about sidebar conversations, we've got some great questions already accumulating here. Let me just pick one that I think, here's one that's nice. This question of individual versus team productivity in remote work. Are individuals more productive, say the lack of distractions, and are teams less productive, harder to coordinate? And I think there's been this kind of discussion where some CEOs are like, I don't like remote work, and then individuals are saying like, oh, I've never been more productive, and like that potential gap. Is there something to this, that it's sort of like as an individual, it's kind of easier to plow through your work, but maybe you're kind of plowing in the wrong direction?
I think it's the definition of what a team is, and I think a team is defined by a group of individuals that comes to achieve something that is greater than the sum of the individual work. And so I think it kind of comes back to what are you trying to do? I think if you sort of do task-based work and you can hand it out and you can say, well, I'll just get 1 + 1 = 2, but if you want 1 + 1 = 3, there is a certain amount of kind of engagement that happens. And so I think the question is maybe not getting to the question behind the question, because I think it comes back to what do we mean by teams versus individuals? And I think we have to kind of define that first.
And maybe just the nature of the work itself, and I think you were getting at, but how well codified is it?
Yeah.
Are you doing sort of routine tasks that then have pretty standardized metrics and you can put those, or is this sort of more ambiguous? Is it creative or innovation that you're trying to do? And then you're going to have a lot more team-based interaction.
Why do you think there's such a polarization in leadership in the industry about bringing people back to the office versus committing to remote? Like, what do you think drives that?
I mean, one cynical answer is that this is a way to do layoffs. Frankly, I mean, we can kind of, they want to cut headcount but don't want to have the reputation for cutting headcount, and so they can kind of pull this like rug pull. But I could imagine just kind of this fundamental tension where I'm trying to organize teams, and it's like hard to get the people I need to talk to on Zoom, and I feel like I don't know what people are working on. Like I guess I can empathize with that leadership position, that it could be more difficult. But as an individual contributor, I mean, you can see the kind of Silicon Valley stereotype of someone coming to the office, an hour on the Caltrain, then they get to the office and put on big headphones so they can try to write some code without someone distracting them. You can completely understand how remote work is in some ways a godsend. Like, as long as you've got an office, you can be very productive. So it's easy for me to empathize with that tension, even if it's not, my personal experience.
Actually, that dovetails a little bit. We talked in the education setting that for some students, the kind of social load is hard. And so this distributed work was actually helpful to learning outcomes.
So how much of it is the work of the individual to be successful versus the kind of environment that we create for them to be successful? Because I think, it's the learnings from COVID is that it was varied. And even after having worked remotely for so long, it was different. And there were things that I had never realized because my experience being remote was very different. And just as a simple example, recent college grads that had come in and joined the team that had just got their own apartment, and when they were isolated, there was nobody else. That's very different than somebody that's established and has a home and has a family, and that's also very different than somebody that may have a family, a couple and 2 kids, or a parent and 2 kids in a small space where it's very difficult to get work done. And so I think those were challenging environmental constraints, but I mean I think we have to enable the individual, but where's that line?
Yeah. No, the difference, it's almost like kind of a generational thing. Like, if you're younger and you're looking for work as partially a social outlet, and it's kind of a big part of your life, and you're hoping to advance in your career, that's very different from someone who's like pretty well established, and they already have their social network, they already have a professional network, they've got friends, they've got kids. I think my spouse, she was working remotely for a large tech company, and she definitely remarked on feeling bad for sort of the new college graduates who are holed up in San Francisco, and they really aren't feeling kind of connected to something like you would if you were sort of part of a team coming in person.
I mean, I have 2 children who began their careers shortly after COVID, and the offices were still remote, but one of the decision criteria for their jobs was, do they actually have a location? And is there somewhere to go? And then the irony is, because the nature of work has become so distributed, that often you'd go to the location and then coordinate with teams that were all over the country or the world anyway.
Was there another question that came in?
There's a bunch of questions.
Let's go. Let's give them
Yeah,
fair.
Let's try to be fair to. Okay, here's one. Bad habits of remote work. Larger meetings when a smaller one will do. You actually brought this up.
Oh, this is horrible. This is like one of my pet peeves. There's no cost to adding another 50 people on the meeting. So you just do it because some people might want to know what happens. And then then the result of that is that meetings become the way that we disseminate information. So if you aren't invited, you don't get the information. If you don't attend, you don't get the information. And if you didn't attend, there's no record of the information after the fact. And I think this kind of goes back to maybe the comment that I wanted to make earlier. It was, I feel like that the competencies of leadership have not changed, but we were just lazy leaders in too many instances before. And I think some of those habits have just carried over. Like, there's just no cost to it. So I've actually had conversations and told some of my engineers, I said, if you get invited to a meeting and you don't have an agenda 24 hours in advance and it doesn't have anything in the email, just decline. And if they complain, just tell them to come to me. Like, you have to give people permission not to go to these meetings.
Well, in the note that you see on the invitation that says the guest list is too large to display is like the biggest red flag in the world. Like, okay, well, there's no way I'm going to this one. Here's a kind of, I think, a nice question, and again, echoes some things we were talking about, that engineers, software developers, potentially more adept at working remotely because they've had the tooling to kind of support this style of work for a very long time, and other kinds of knowledge workers, the tooling really wasn't there. And so I think there's kind of this question of, let me just paraphrase the question. What are best practices we can learn from software tools to apply them more generally?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in, but I don't know, you look contemplative over there, Geoff.
Well, I think the tools have improved dramatically, but you're right. And, we have evidence from some of these distributed, knowledge work problems that different tools solve different problems. And so we have these software tools, but we also have organizational design tools. So for example, unifying teams to increase internal communication can kind of solve one type of problem, but often at the cost of exacerbating or slowing things down in some other areas. So I think we shouldn't assume that even better tools are silver bullets.
I used to report to a VP of engineering, and he would always tell me that it's a poor craftsman that blames his tools. And I've sort of translated that into, if you know what you're doing, you can make any tool work. If you don't know what you're doing, no tool's going to solve the problem for you. I think that there are certain things from a work coordination standpoint from software development, because we've had to build sort of large complex systems, that are really useful. I think we use a methodology for building software. It's called Scrum at Scale, and it's you do sort of the kind of individual team Scrum, and then you scale it kind of in the same way, and that gives you kind of a way to connect the information flow throughout the organization. I have 4 or 5 different messaging apps, so I'm kind of available on all of those, and while I'm not available 24/7, that ability to reach out, and I've always sort of said, the definition of success from like a one-on-one or a roundtable is that the people in the meeting feel comfortable enough that they can just pick up the phone and call. And there's times where the phone is all that you need. Like email, I think if you go sort of multiple rounds in email, you just need to pick up the phone. And I think we've lost some of the low-tech solutions that have actually sort of helped on the conversation. So there's, Teams, Slack, Miro. There's an interesting discussion about the persistence versus the ephemeral nature of information. And the reason why sticky notes were used in software development is because nobody felt bad about crumbling it up and throwing it away. But once you put it in a Word document or a Google Doc, or once you put it on a Miro board, it seems to get a level of permanence that people don't want to touch. And I think that collaboration and sort of viewing digital information because I'm going to save it because we might need it in the future. I mean, how often do you actually go back and search through your archives? It's very rare, yeah. But we save it anyways, So
kind of the medium is the message a little bit, right? Like how you choose to convey something is sort of.
Yep. I think they're related.
Saying something.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah, I frequently will say, "This is a phone call."
Yep.
Once you go enough, just because it's getting silly to have a high bandwidth chat conversation.
Well, and even, I don't know, engineers are kind of funny because we always get sort of this reputation of being sort of the salty crowd that doesn't have good social interaction, which is not true. But, the media, email, Slack, Teams, it all comes back to communication. And there's a certain amount of bandwidth that you can push through that and a certain amount of tone that doesn't, and that's when you just sort of have to go back and rely on kind of the old school things. Yeah.
And this may be kind of, Geoff, what you were saying about organizational practices. Like a lot of it is really not so much the technology, but it's kind of coming up with consensus about, like this is how we use these tools. Like this is what's for this and this is what's for that. And maybe we're kind of like groping towards these sort of solutions in most organizations, but that does seem like a key part of this. Like when do you use phone? When do you use text? When do you use?
Yeah, I like that because that sort of hits a few points. And again, it goes back to the no silver bullets and adapting these solutions and tools to organizational culture and then context of the problems you're trying to solve. And I think that goes directly to that.
I'll say one more thing and we can get to another question. I do think there's a psychological cost to the asynchronous communication. And I think it was Cal Newport in his book, A World Without Email, talks about sort of this notion of this sort of psychological thing built into us to reply to somebody when they text to us. So we spend up all of our time. I think the communication costs start to skyrocket. And I think that's one of the challenges that I don't think that the tools can solve for us. I think that's more of an organization and sort of an interpersonal thing. But I think that's something we have to be careful of as well.
So, John, you asked a great question, or we talked about it. Why are you so exhausted at the end of a day of Zoom, even more so than perhaps in-person meetings?
It's got its own term. It's like I'm zoomed out. Like it's literally like it's become a verb or it's become a phrase at this point.
I mean, my armchair, and I literally have an armchair. My armchair psychological theory is that, because it's, you're kind of worried about, well, one, you're staring at your own face a lot of the time. You can't quite hear people. You're sort of worried about stepping on someone else who's talking. All your energy, you're focused on a tiny screen. I think there's like a bunch of things that are just like tiny little costs or tiny pebbles in your shoe that make it tiring in a way that, I don't know, I think person-to-person interactions can be more energizing. And I think it's because we're not, you can hear perfectly, you kind of have this very like, I can see your body language, I can, there's a lot of things that are, I think, very nice about in person, and that's my pet theory. But
I think it is the cognitive load, and I think there's also, I mean, it's probably the embarrassing thing to say, but there's this certain amount of focus to not do something embarrassing while you're on camera, but that is a certain cognitive load. It is something that you're keeping in mind. You're sort of on display, and when you go back to back, and I also think that there's this context switch. When we load up meetings back to back, there's this context switch between one to the next, and you're trying to be fully focused, you're trying to be fully present, and then it just consumes the calories in your body. I think your brain just kind of chews through them. So
I was on a Zoom meeting, and I had some wood paneling behind me, and someone slacked me, and they said, "Are you in a sauna?" And I got bright red because I was so embarrassed, which made it look more like I was in a sauna. And so, like, no matter how much I denied it, it really looked like I was in a sauna. And, that's just an occupational hazard of in-person remote work.
It is true. What's next?
So let's talk a little bit about the future.
Okay.
Because I think we've got learnings from the past, and you've got a lot of experience, and we've studied some of these things in multiple contexts of sort of online and gig work and distributed systems. Where do you see some of this going? Just in terms of the technology, for example, are we all going to be in the metaverse, and that's going to somehow be the new silver bullet that's going to make this? Or what elements would you think of in-person trips? We're worried about consuming carbon, or carbon emissions rather, when we schedule these big meetings, and so that becomes a topic of discussion.
I have a few thoughts, John, but you kind of giggled, so.
Yeah, I mean, well, so I think one thing that, even if, say, remote work, despite all of our best efforts, was still somewhat inferior to what we remembered or, what we thought, I think the advantages of being able to recruit broadly, to, be able to take, and like, people can have a nicer or bigger house, where they want to be, closer to family. There's all these kind of like enormous kind of economic benefits related to not having labor markets be so shaped by geography that I think like we could have an equilibrium where, like, yeah, it doesn't work as well, but people like it so much, and there's so many like amenity values that it still persists. That being said, I'm long-term bullish on remote or hybrid work, because I do think, like, any given day, this is the worst it'll ever be, because there's so much entrepreneurial energy and people thinking about best practices. I mean, like, why are we even here? Why are we talking about this? At least partially, people at home, you're thinking about, like, well, how do we make this work better in our organization? That's why we're having these discussions. I think just collectively, that's what we'll continue to do, because the benefits of not having to make everyone live within commuting distance of a certain area, they're so large that, I'm long-term very bullish.
I think that actually creates a challenge for leadership and talent retention. And I think you sort of, when people can work from anywhere, you sort of removed one of the forces that sort of kept people in jobs. Now, I think that's good from a quality of life standpoint, but it also means that leaders now have to really focus on a barrier that was there that's no longer there. I think that leaders are going to have to be more cross-functional type of leaders. And what I mean by that is, I think you're going to have to be part organizational psychologist. I think you're going to have to be a leader. I think you're going to have to be an engineer, because I think you're going to have to draw from all of these domains to be able to, I think the three things that are really critical. One is individuals need to have a sense of autonomy. You have to push decision-making out to the edges of the organization. Number two, you have to have alignment. And so autonomy without alignment leads to really bad outcomes. And so I kind of have this analogy of if you're putting a bathroom in a house, the first question you've got to ask is, are the pipes run to all the rooms that I need it to be? For a lot of organizations, you have to start and ask from a communication standpoint, are the pipes run to all the rooms? And if they are they actually doing what they're supposed to do, or are they clogged up? And so I think autonomy, I think alignment, and then I think diversity, but diversity in an input of ideas, because I think innovation can stagnate if the social circles of the people becomes very closed. If it's a closed loop system, then you get either in isolation or you get in an echo chamber. So I think you need all three of those. I think there's a couple of fascinating conversations to have. The metaverse, from a remote work standpoint, I think one of the big things against it is it removes one of the sources of information. The biggest challenge that we've had with remote work is body language. So now you're going to go into a virtual reality where your avatar is whatever you want it to look like and expresses whatever you want. So, the question is, like, how does that make it worse? Maybe you get spatial awareness from a sound standpoint, but am I really more productive to go sit at a picnic table in a virtual reality and then have a conversation and then be able to be distracted by people that are talking behind me? I do think, though, from a communication standpoint, there's some fascinating lessons to be learned from the way that the formats that we use for communicating information on social media. Short form video. Instead of all hands, let's start doing podcasts. Let's start doing sort of 15-minute, YouTube updates kind of style things. So I think, from a streaming standpoint, from a audience retention standpoint, using some of those techniques and some of those learnings to communicate the information, I think those are fascinating threads to pull, and I don't think we've really pulled them yet. So,
Related to that, you might imagine too, with some of the advances in conversational AI and generative AI, even say like that big meeting that you don't want to go to, you could send your AI agent, that can take notes for you, or kind of maybe try to summarize all the information that's coming, all these different channels. I'm very excited about some of the things that might happen in that space around facilitating remote work more generally.
So I'm actually glancing over, and I'm seeing a couple of interesting threads, and it's around, and it circles back to the measuring output versus outcomes. And actually, this has been a subject of discussion for a long time around, why does sort of the rise of a product organization or product management, which talks a whole lot about not just delivering a set of features, but actually solving a specific problem as an outcome. Maybe that's one of the ways that some of that sort of movement, if you will infuse even in this distributed
It's hard,
environment.
though. It's really hard. So if you look at some of the techniques that are being used in leadership in the industry, things like objectives and key results, it's really hard to come up with those key results, right? Because if you're trying to hire somebody, your key result is not, I want to interview 13 people. Like, that's a vanity metric. So I think in entrepreneurship and startups, in a lot of leadership practices, coming up with the right metric that actually measures the outcome that you're trying to achieve to is really hard. And so I think we need more practice at that.
No, absolutely. So we're actually pretty close to time. I think we maybe have one more question that we can do. So let's see.
Well, while you're scrolling,
yes.
let me circle back to, you said you're bullish on sort of remote distributed work. So if you're the mayor of New York, Boston, San Francisco, Paris, your tax revenues are heavily dependent upon a knowledge workforce. And is that something that the amenities of the city are going to continue to retain that? Net, it's all going to be okay? Or is this the final sort of nail in the coffin of what we saw of the future of distributed workforces?
I don't know that it's going to shift the needle. I think that may be less about, that may be more of an individual kind of question. And I'll answer from this perspective. I stayed where I did because of family. And there was a quality of life that came out of that, but it was not easy. It required a lot of time on a plane. My wife and I, one of actually the things that we liked was the ability to sort of spend time in sort of larger cities and then come home and sort of be close to family. So there was this kind of duality of existence. And I think, I think that there's an economic question of, are you going to be able to sort of retain a workforce that actually drives infrastructure and drives kind of the tax revenue in the city to be able to pay for that? So it's a bit of a, it's almost like maybe sort of an economy or an environmental sort of weather system. It's very fragile. I don't know where the tipping is. The tipping point, I don't know how resilient it is. I think that's a question to ask.
I think that I'm long-term bullish on cities too. I think we'll probably just get a sorting where you have more people living in the cities by choice because they value the amenities and prices will adjust. That being said, I could imagine there's a lot of short-term disruption and sort of pain as you kind of get to some sort of new equilibrium. So we are actually out of time. So thank you very much to both of you. That was very nice. And looking forward to the rest of the day.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. We'll be heading into another break. We will start up again, top of the hour at noon Eastern time with an interesting conversation around can AI put humans first? Sanjeev Bora and Renee.
That was great.
See you then. Thanks.